again, it feels very strange to take this off. So, good morning.
Morning.
This is my first time giving a talk in the hall, actually being in the hall with the doors open. So having inside, outside, cyberly sharing this time with you. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. Strange times, huh? How is everyone? And just for those of you online, if you ever want to, if I invite or you need to speak, you just plunge in, you just unmute yourself. And for you guys, Gasho and chime in. How is everyone? It's, yeah. Genki's like, meh. Yeah, I mean, the last time I asked that question last week, right? The doors were closed. We were on fire. As I said last week, we're always on fire, but we knew we were on fire. And that was intense, right? And then I don't know if you're like me, this just is the way that I'm built, but the minute, looking at the AQI, any of you like compulsively like, well, what's our number today? What's the number now? Our air quality index? It's like, we're below 100, we're moderate. And then that like literal breath of relief and breathing the air, I can hear the birds. They're birds, there's sky. And if you're like me, sort of one breath in, you feel that relief, and the next breath you feel guilt, sadness. Like, we're okay, but, what's really changed? What's cosmically, globally changed? So I want to say a bunch of things today. One thing I want to say, and this relates to the topic and the continuation of what I shared last week. So if there's an utterly reliable quality to the sorrow that rises, when the heartache that rises, when we realize the world is literally on fire, if that's utterly reliable, the relief is utterly reliable too. These are two sides of the same deep realization of our fundamental wholeness. So last week, one of the things I was suggesting is not to be afraid of the dukkha, of the suffering, of the sense of heartache that we encounter. I suggested, again, that's utterly reliable. When we feel our heart ache, we can trust that ache. And we can trust that ache because in a fundamental sense, our hand is being forced, right? What hurts us is the recognition that we are connected to everything. So there's always this kind of, I almost want to say a double edge of dukkha, that recognition that we're connected to everything, a sense of our wholeness. And then pardon the French, oh shit, and what about the safety of my little self, right? And when the recognition of the connection to wholeness itself hurts, what hurts is the recognition that the hurt that little Myobun feels is everybody's hurt. Not that you're literally inside my brain, which is probably lucky for you, but that individually we suffer because collectively we suffer, collectively we suffer because individually we suffer. And that's the good news. That's the good news. So I told the story from the Jataka tales, these tales of the Buddha before he was the Buddha, his countless lifetimes, no beginning, no end. I told this story from the Jataka tale of the Buddha when he was a gray little parrot, and I shifted the gender, which I'll do again. This gray little parrot, brave little parrot, she's flying in the forest, realizes that the forest is on fire. Now, no matter how little a parrot you are, you do have wings, so you can fly away. But the parrot in that moment, realizing that the tree's on fire, the animals trapped in the fire, this 170,000 acres of burning forest, that was her body. That was her body too. And so what does she do? She flies to the river, picks up a little water in her beak and her little parrot wings. Reiko reminded us last week that other versions of the story she's heard talk about a hummingbird, like this really teeny, teeny, tiny being that's just got a little teeny beak, little teeny fluttering wings, picking up water, dropping the water ineffectually on the flames, right? And one celestial being transforms into an eagle, a great big eagle, who squeezes together the clouds and rains fall down upon the forest. That story, that story is an indication of the way in which being touched to the quick, to the heart, is reliable, right? Is totally reliable. But that ache is also the ache that we feel in moments of joy and beauty, love, happiness, excitement, right? Because I have very bad circulation, for me, the image, and I used this image last week, that I always have is the pain that comes into my hands. If my hands lose feeling, get numb because of cold, and I run them under warm water, that ache of them thawing out, that ache as my lifeblood fills the wholeness of my body. That's a kind of heartache too, but the heartache that I know is about life returning. Saul Bellow, in his book, Henderson, the Rain King, describes the ache in our gums that comes when we see beauty, when we appreciate beauty. Not to be afraid of that ache in all of its manifestations. And then that other story that I told last week, and pardon me for kind of rehearsing these stories. I know not all of you were here last week, so that's the method in my madness and my repetition, but also because I just have a few stories, and hey, I'm sticking to them. But this story of literal story, historical story, true story of the Golden Buddha in Bangkok, Thailand. Right? This Buddha that for centuries was hidden underneath stucco and concrete, had been covered over to protect it from marauding Burmese invaders. And then over the centuries, everyone forgot that there was a golden Buddha underneath until 1955, when they're trying to move this 6-ton Buddha, this 10-foot Buddha, this concrete Buddha, and they drop it, and the little plaster chips away. And there's gold underneath, right? Our ego, we really need it. We really need the defenses that we build up over the years. Those of us who are deeply committed to practicing the way of letting body and mind drop, of finding our true groundlessness, of letting go of ego. I just want to say, thank goodness we have egos. They protect us. Thank goodness we have the stucco that surrounds us and protects us. And thank goodness that stucco is always already cracked. It's never complete, never, ever. The golden Buddha, the casing is always already cracked. The gold always already is shining through. The defenses are always incomplete, because how could they be otherwise? How could we utterly 100% defend ourselves from the absolute truth of our wholeness, of our interconnection? So the Buddha's always cracked. Someone last week asked me, once you get to the golden Buddha, is part of practice discovering that it's cracked too? It's like the cracking is us. We are the cracking. That's how the light doesn't just enter. That's how the light shines through from within. So what breaks our heart, that ache in the gums, in the heart, in the gut, in the mind, in the fingertips as they thaw out, what aches is what takes us home. So I touched on this last week. The famous mythologist and literature professor, I was a literature professor once, so that touches my heart, Joseph Campbell, has called this sense of that cracking within and our leaning into that cracking, that idea that we might follow the crack once we become aware of it. He talked about it as following our bliss. I know more about cracking than bliss. I say follow the crack that reveals the gold. And it strikes me that crack that reveals the gold, that's the yellow brick road, folks. Okay, so like, true fact, one of my all-time favorite teaching texts is the 1939 film of The Wizard of Oz. If you haven't seen it recently, I heartily encourage you to see it again. I watched it again about a month ago, and I was expecting it to be like 4 hours long, because that's how I remember it, like really long. It's only 90 minutes, folks. It's not that long. So, The Wizard of Oz. Just a little reminder of some of the salient points in that film as a way of getting into what it means to follow the crack, and how this yellow brick road, this cracking path, is the Buddha way. You know, we talk about the Buddha way. The Buddha way is unsurpassable, right? And sometimes we forget that way is path. Way is journey. Way is road. So, you know, how do things begin for dear old Dorothy Gale? You know, she's hanging out in Kansas, and from the get-go, although her life is good, I mean, it's sepia-toned, it's not in color, but although her life is good, you know, in the farmhands, you know, there's Hunk and Hickory and Zeke, right, who go on to become the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, and the Cowardly Lion in the color underworld that she goes to in the middle of the film. But, you know, the farmhands are there. It's a good life, and yet she knows, right? Something's off, something's missing. And so I like to think of this somewhere over the rainbow moment that we all have, moments that we have. These moments that sort of break into our everyday. You know, in musical, these are the musical numbers that break into our everyday, and it's like, you know, nothing's really changed, nothing's really happened, and yet, what's out there over the rainbow? There's something out there. Dorothy knows this because the something that's out there, as I was saying last week, is already in here, right? But then things happen. The plaster that is already cracked, always already cracked. The reason we know that there's somewhere over the rainbow is because the casing is never complete. But then something happens that really jars things loose. So in the Dharma of Dorothy, what happens is, what's her name? Elmira. I wrote it down because I couldn't remember. The one who becomes the wicked witch. Yes. Thank you. Elmira Gulch. There's a name. Elmira Gulch. And even the name kind of invokes cracking and sort of yawning gulf. Elmira Gulch is going to take away little Toto to be euthanized, right? So a first little cracking, and then Dorothy, I'm going to leave my safe home. I'm going to go. I have to go. Picks up Toto, and then she goes out on the road and she encounters Professor Marvell, right? Who is the guy who goes on to, in the world within the world, the dream within the world, in the land of Oz, turns out to be the Wizard of Oz. And do you remember what happens? He's a charlatan, right? He's actually the film's version of Lord Mara, right? He's full of delusion, of what the film calls humbug. And he says to Dorothy, he peeks into her knapsack. He says, close my eyes and I'm going to, read your fortune, look into the crystal ball. And he peeks into her knapsack and he sees a picture of Auntie Em, and he's like, I see an older woman and she's grieving, she's weeping, somebody has broken her heart. He's lying to Dorothy, right? He's pretending that he sees something which he doesn't see. And Dorothy thinks, Auntie Em, and she runs home. I tell this detail because it's so important to realize that we may be completely deluded about what the nature of suffering is, about what the owie is. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if Auntie Em, it matters to Auntie Em of Dorothy, of course, if Auntie Em is really sick or not, because the heartache, the love, the connection with Auntie Em, that's real. So again, your dukkha, the sense of the crack, it's utterly, utterly reliable. 100%. And then the tornado happens. But it's important to realize the tornado isn't where it starts. The tornado comes, that transformative event that takes Dorothy through the gate onto her way, onto the yellow brick road. That tornado comes as the result of Dorothy's heart being completely cracked open. The entire world opens up when we hearken to the sense of our own owie. The entire world opens up because it was already open. We just didn't know it. Just like it's always on fire, we just don't often see it. And so then celestial guidance comes. We've got Glinda the Good Witch. We also have the scary, huge dangers, the fire-breathing dragons in the form of the Wicked Witch of the West. And we have the companions, we have the mentors, the guides, the fellows along the way. What is revealed in all of the moments after Dorothy passes through the gate is a whole world to sustain and support us. It was there all along. We couldn't see it. Just as when Dorothy comes home, she's like, and you were there, and you were there, and you were there, right? It was all there all along. And now that giant celestial eagle fills the sky and brings down rain. So follow the yellow brick road. So just 10 years after MGM puts out The Wizard of Oz, Joseph Campbell writes this book that becomes really, really famous and popular called The Hero of a Thousand Faces. And this is the book where he popularizes, he doesn't invent it exactly, but he pulls it together through his study of world religions, his study of comparative mythology, his study of culture, high culture, low culture. He popularizes the idea of the hero's journey, which he calls a monomyth. He borrows that term from James Joyce. He works with literature. He works with like all the sources he can get his hands on. And he is also influenced by the psychoanalyst Carl Jung, because the story he tells, which is the sort of archetype of archetypes, is the story of the self. It's the story of each of us, the story of the seeker, the story from Gilgamesh to the Avengers, although Campbell didn't get into the Marvel universe, alas for him. It's the story of what it means to venture forth and find our original face, our authenticity. So Campbell says, he defines, and have you guys heard this phrase, the hero's journey? It's kind of out there, pretty, yeah. It's been around. He defines it as, in these terms, he says, a hero ventures forth from the world of common day into a region of supernatural wonder. Fabulous forces are there encountered, and a decisive victory is won. The hero comes back from the mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons on his fellow man. Think about all the big stories that you've ever seen on the big screen. Think about all the stories you've seen in the movies, on TV, that you've read in books, that you've heard in churches and temples. One of the filmmakers who did a documentary on Joseph Campbell says that the monomyth, this hero's journey, is in effect a meta-myth, a philosophical reading of the unity of mankind's spiritual history, the story behind the story. Now, universal is always a tricky term, so if you want to hold this with a grain of salt, I heartily encourage that. But there does seem to be something recurrent across every world culture I've encountered of this story, of what it means to recognize something missing, knowing our inner wholeness, going forth only to come home. This homecoming that requires a journey because we don't know. I'm trying to remember the phrase from The Wizard of Oz when Glinda tells Dorothy, you always were able to go home, you just didn't know it. You just don't know who you already are. As Campbell outlines this, there are 17 stages to the hero's journey, and they encompass things like the call to adventure, the refusal of the call, supernatural aid, and sort of going through the first threshold, all sorts of things. But ultimately, those 17 stages, which, by the way, inspired George Lucas in the writing of Star Wars. He explicitly built his story of Luke Skywalker on the hero's journey. But ultimately, those 17 stages really break down to 3 big steps. Separation, the hero, the self, the bodhisattva, recognizing a kind of separation, initiation, and return. What I really value about the hero's journey is the way it helps me understand the way, the Buddha way as a path, as a journey, and helps me understand the way in which my traveling on the way begins with a call, with that somewhere over the rainbow moment, which I have, and I don't know if I'm alone in this, but I have experienced all my life as a kind of restlessness, like, why am I not content? What's missing? What am I looking for? Why do I keep looking? A kind of restless impatience. And I introduced the term discernment last week. Discernment is that activity of tuning our ears to the call. Like, what is that? What is poking me? What is prodding me? What is plucking me as if it's out there? And yet, I would only feel that way if it were already here. What is that? So I value that way in which Joseph Campbell's ideas help me realize that the hero's journey is something that begins, my path is something that begins with a call. And I value the way in which his teaching helps us recognize that we can only hear the call because we already know its truth. And finally, I value what he offers in his description of this spiritual history by his recognition that this is a circle, that the way is all about coming home. So, incidentally, Campbell's archetype for this archetype, his story for this story of stories that he keeps coming back to in that 1949 book is the story of Siddhartha. It's the Buddha's story. That's where he goes to for the kind of main lineaments and structure of his notion of this monomyth. And, you know, there are lots of things he says, and he goes to sources like the Jataka tales, for instance. He goes to scriptures. He's not a Buddhist. He doesn't dive into the Dharma. He's just looking at the story, the mythology, the imagery. And he unpacks it in all sorts of ways that are super interesting. What I'm most interested in is his unpacking of Siddhartha's discernment of the call. And that lies in the familiar story, familiar to us, I think, to many of us in this hall, out there, online, of the 4 sights, right? The story of the 4 sights. So the story goes, and some of you have heard this a zillion times, so bear with me. But there's something about that repetition that kind of sinks in and can kind of refresh us if we let it. the story goes that, you have the prince Siddhartha, whose father has heard a prophecy that his son is either going to be the greatest ruler ever, or a sage, a seeker, someone who retires from the world. Well, the father invested in his legacy, his kingdom, everything he knows, the world as he knows it, wants his son not to retire from the world, not to become a sage, but to stay and be the next ruler. And so, again, these are familiar archetypes. And so the palace that the young Siddhartha grows up in is a palace that's filled with everything that you could want, everything that could quiet that somewhere over the rainbow. This isn't a sepia-colored Kansas. This is a palace. And yet, Siddhartha yearns to see what he can't see, but what he knows is there. And he asks his charioteer Channa to take him out beyond the castle, out beyond the palace. And the future Buddha sees 4 sights. So on the first day he ventures forth, he sees someone with wrinkles and graying hair. He sees an older person, someone aged. And he says, and these are the words from one of the Jataka tales, he says to Channa, he says, "Friend, pray, who is this man? Even his hair is not like that of other men," because it's gray, right, and falling out. And when he heard the answer, he said, "Shame on birth, since to everyone that is born, old age must come." Shame on birth, since to everyone that is born, old age must come. Notice the shape of his response to Channa. It's got several components. One of the components is the shame, which I find really interesting. It reminds me that suffering, the pain of suffering, is really closely allied with anger and indignation, that sense of this is wrong, our sense of what isn't just, right? It reminds me of another kind of seeker of the way in the mold that Joseph Campbell recounts. It reminds me of Thoreau, and what Thoreau writes in Walden about his desire to go hang out, not that very far from where he lives, but to hang out in the woods. He says, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life," Thoreau writes, "and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, what life had to teach, and not when I came to die discover that I had not lived." He says, "I wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life, to live so sturdily and Spartan-like as to put a route to all that was not life, to cut a broad swath and shave close, to drive life into a corner and reduce it to its lowest terms. I did not wish to live what was not life," he says. That feeling of like, you know what? If this isn't good, I want to know. That sense of justice, of anger, of passion, right? What do I want to say? The embers flickering forth of that activist urge to face what isn't right. So the future Buddha says, "Shame on birth, since to everyone that is born, old age must come." So that's that component, that justice-seeking component, that righteous indignation component. The other component that's so important is that the Buddha's recognition of that first sight is to say, wow, this happens to everyone. That recognition of the all, of everything, of wholeness, of interconnection. And so day after day, for the next 3 days, he sees 3 more sights. The next day he sees someone who's ill. The day after that he sees a corpse. And then comes the 4th day when he sees a mendicant, a monk, a holy person who has given up worldly pursuits to seek the way. That 4th sight is really important, right? That way in which, with the arising of this awareness of a universal suffering, what also arises in the same moment is inspiration. That glimmering vision of, oh, there's another way. We see the crack, we see the gold. We can't just see one and not the other, even if we're not really fully aware of either what the crack is or what the gold is, even if we're sort of dazzled with humbug, to use that word for delusion from the The Wizard of Oz. Still, crack, aspiration. The two arise together. The story of the four sights is the story of vow, of how vow arises in the context of our awareness of suffering, right? Now, what is vow? I mean, we often think of vow, I think of vow in terms of resolution, of something about the future, right? You know, whether it's a wedding vow, or it's the vows we're going to hear next week when Joichi is ordained. Where are you, Joichi? Woot woot, Joichi. Get ready. You know, the vow of becoming a Buddhist, of becoming a novice, of becoming a disciple. And one of the phrases that we say in those kinds of Zen ceremonies is the preceptor Ejo will ask us to recite, you know, whether from this day forth until that of becoming a Buddha, we're willing to take up this particular vow. From this day forth until that of becoming a Buddha, do you accept this precept or not? Will you maintain this precept or not? Vows often have in our understanding of them this sense of being totally future directed, right? That day of becoming a Buddha, right? They're focused on the future. And that can be terrifying. I know the story of a friend who had a couple of marriages in which the wedding ceremony vows were slightly altered to be till I take you as my beloved, for as long as we both shall love, not for as long as we both shall live. The impulse behind that, right, is responding to the way in which the future-directed sense of vow can do this really paradoxical thing, can seem to do this really paradoxical thing, right? The vow arises in this moment of seeing the glint of gold underneath the cracking Buddha, right? It arises in this moment of freedom, a sense, an intention, what the scriptures call bodhicitta, the arising of the mind of an awakening, rises up in us. Total freedom. And then the minute we enact a vow, we seem locked into a vision of the future. Right? Is this a familiar paradox? Like all of that freedom, all of that intentionality seems to empty out the underside of the vow, because now we have this mechanical thing that we're like, okay, I've taken a vow. I now will move toward my future. The vow is pulling me. I either live up to it or I break it, and I don't want to break it. So what happens to that liveliness of intention? So sometimes people will say, and I think this is a fabulous thing to say, is that, you know, each day, each moment, we need to renew our vows. We need to revisit them. So you have things like renewal ceremonies for weddings. You know, we do Jukai, and in Jukai, everyone who has taken Jukai before also retakes the vow. We have a whole atonement ceremony, Fusatsu, whose fundamental center is the renewing of our vows, right? So that's one way that we respond to this this kind of paradox at the heart of vow, this way in which this thing that emerges as this glint of gold can quickly become this sense of, oh, now I'm just constrained by another bit of concrete. Does that make sense what I'm saying? Right? That paradox. Well, we renew our vows. But I kind of like to say, instead of thinking about renewing your vow, keeping the promise, the resolve alive, I say, nah, keep the possibility of breaking the vow alive. Keep that possibility alive. The vow bespeaks our wholeness. In another set of causes and conditions, when I was a literature professor, one of the things that I studied was John Milton, you know, the guy who wrote Paradise Lost. John Milton's a really interesting guy. Why did he feel the need to tell the story of the fall, of Satan and man's ultimate breaking of their promise, breaking of vow with God. Milton wanted to be able to talk about free will. He wanted to be able to talk about the ways in which our freedom is alive precisely because we face at every moment the possibility of resistance. So, fun fact, Milton also argued against pretty much everyone in his day. He argued in favor of divorce. Divorce wasn't legal in England at that time. So he wrote not only Paradise Lost, but a treatise called The Disciplines and Doctrine of Divorce. Because he recognized, like, if any vow is to be legitimate, we have to keep alive the breaking of it. This is how the vow, the possibility of passing through a gate, relates to our own sense of wholeness, relates to that recognition of the universality, not only of suffering, but also of liberation. So I'm, someone who resonates to the whole concept at a deep level of my own resistance. And it's my melancholy nature, my, overly philosophical nature, perhaps, but there are those moments. Chosen Bays, one of the co-abbot of Great Vow Zen Monastery, has written a book. It's quite a good, useful book called The Vow-Powered Life. And in it, she at one point says, maybe one of the best definitions for a vow is what gets you out of bed in the morning. Now, as someone who sometimes finds it a little bit hard to get out of bed in the morning, that's kind of an interesting definition. I want to say this to you. This is kind of my inverted pep talk, I guess. If you, like me, have those moments when you just go, ugh, when you just think, I don't want to push it anymore, where life in its sense of, again, things are burning again, okay, let me gather up my bodhicitta, let me gather up my sense of inspiration to move forward. When that freedom and that energetic movement forward feels like, oh, really? I want to encourage you to take heart. The resistance is not what gets in the way of vow. The resistance is a part of us. The resistance is just another part of that cracking open inside. So if I want to say to you guys, follow the crack, I also want to say to you, follow the ugh. It too is reliable because this path is a path of wholeness. We don't get to leave anything out. We're golden Buddhas, but we're also covered in concrete. That's who we are. It's all a part of it all. So I want to share one more thing, and then we'll have a few minutes for questions or comments. And it's a poem by a woman named, quite good poet named Marie Howe. And she wrote it for Stephen Hawking. It has a little bit of physics at its core. He's among other things, the guy who wrote the book, A Brief History of Time, about the Big Bang. So the poem is called Singularity. So if you didn't resonate to The Wizard of Oz, maybe you'll resonate to this poem. Singularity. Do you sometimes want to wake up to the singularity we once were? So compact, nobody needed a bed or food or money. Nobody hiding in the school bathroom or home alone pulling open the drawer where the pills were kept. For every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. Remember? There was no nature, no them, no tests to determine if the elephant grieves her calf or if the coral reef feels pain. Trashed oceans didn't speak English or Farsi or French. Would that we could wake up to what we were when we were ocean. And before that, to when sky was earth, and animal was energy, and rock was liquid, and stars were space, and space was not at all nothing. Before we came to believe humans were so important, before this awful loneliness. Can molecules recall it? What once was, before anything happened? No I, no we, no one, no was, no verb, no noun. Only a tiny, tiny dot brimming with is, all, everything. Home. Questions, comments, push back, push forward, push sideways.
You're muted.
Tenkan, are you trying to talk?
Yeah, okay, yes, I'm attempting to. I was thinking when you were giving a very good talk about the Leonard Cohen song, whose name I can't recall.
Anthem?
And in it there's a line,
There's a crack.
there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets through.
Yeah. Yeah, so, and I too, I mean, Leonard Sensei, I too, I was talking with Kogan before, such an incredible, and he, was many things, including a Buddhist monk for a period. I love what he says, and what I want to bring into that is that it's not just that the crack allows the light in. The crack is what lets us know our original face. The light's already in. It lets the light out. It undoes inside and outside. Yeah. Yeah.
Start yourself off, yeah.
Yeah.
I just have this image I want to share with you about cracks. My father was a geologist for many years, and in Joshua Tree, we would go sometimes when we were going over those boulders, which are just enormous, smooth. Sometimes you'll see this weird alignment where a crack of quartz crystal will just go through the whole hillside of many rocks. And he was explaining that that happens because deep in the earth, before the boulders were boulders, but like an ocean of cooling stone underground, as the stone cooled, some great pressure caused it to crack. And then that crack filled with more magma, but cooled at a different rate and became crystal. So this break and this quality of light and luminosity deep in earth keeps coming up. As you
Thank you, Jacqueline. I always feel like you keep me honest with my metaphors, whether I'm talking about weaving or cracking. And I invite you, metaphor is how my mind it's a huge part of my spiritual practice, is working with metaphor. And Ed just talked to us a lot about the imaginal realm. And I encourage you, if I bring forward images or stories or ways of talking about stories and they don't quite resonate, I encourage you to find the things that do. It's so powerful that we can see truth reflected in, cooling magma. I also want to just make explicit that my reverse pep talk about following the crack and following the ugh, right? I want to make explicit the ways in which that also is an invitation. We're about next week to embark on to practice term, which is an opportunity for some of us to take up commitments for a period of time, right? For not forever, not till death do us part, for 90 days, right? And the ways in which that wisdom built into our tradition of having these terms and these opportunities to grab hold of that living light that we've touched upon, and then okay, now I'm going to put it into a form, and I'm going to sit zazen every day, and I'm going to do this, and the way in which that then makes us confront our resistance. We sometimes in Zen speak about the hindrances, the things that get in the way of the path. There is nothing that gets in the way of the path. What gets in the way of the way is the way itself, right? So I encourage you to encounter the depth of your resistance and to exult in it. If that's not too perverse a thing to say. Yeah, coaching.
I'm assuming when they saw the crack in the golden Buddha,
Yeah.
that there was a fair amount of energy that went into pulling all the concrete back and going, dude, we got a golden Buddha. Yeah. And then following that for ever and ever. Could you just speak to the part of the practice here is nothing to attain. Part of it is no preference. I see a little crack, in something in my life, and there's gold, and I want to go, boom, go into that, open, and I'm like, oh, maybe that's attaining, maybe that's a preference, maybe that's not the path. I don't know.
What do you actually encounter when you meet that energy that says, let me dive in and pull it away, and what do you actually encounter in that moment when you work with the golden Buddha as if it's something separate from you? What do you encounter?
Alternatively, freedom and joy and hope and grief.
So pay attention to all of that. I think the only problem comes when we freeze ourselves in a moment now, and a future there, and a past there, and we stop paying attention to the way in which the terrain is always giving us achy moments, joyous moments. It's always infallibly pointing us right back home. So in my experience, that sense of, gold, is, like when I first started becoming a serious practitioner, I got all manner of stuff that wasn't gold at home, because suddenly I was like at the Zendo all the time, right? That was real. So now the way is giving me that. Home. Actual home. Eternal, authentic home. So just pay attention. It's infallible. Yeah.
So what Tony was saying, he was saying, like, when you find the crack and you want to get in and get the golden Buddha out, and like I've had that experience, but then it's like when you have the golden Buddha, and then there's a crack in the golden Buddha, and you open that up and there's like another golden Buddha, and there's like another crack, and so it's like, for me, it's like I have that experience where I want to get in there, and then I feel like I have this golden Buddha, and then the golden Buddha gets a crack, and then I go into that one, and it's like there's like infinite golden Buddhas that are inside. And that's kind of what I got when you were saying follow the crack. It's like there's this, for me as a human being, there's this sense like, oh, I've got it. And then it cracks again, and then it's like, oh, I've got it now. And then it cracks again, and it's like, oh, I've got it. And so now it's kind of like I'm looking for the crack. Like the crack is like the kind of thing that's guiding me, like, oh, that's the thing that's going to get me to this kind of certain, like it's like, yeah.
Sometimes the crack feels like, really? Again? But I thought, and sometimes the crack feels like, maybe I was really wrong. And sometimes the crack feels like, okay. So there's not one way that this sense of luminosity makes its presence known. There's a lifetimes of ways that it makes it known. Just take heart. Keep where you are. Keep paying attention. It's not so sexy in the end. Like, keep paying attention. Yeah. And take heart.
Thank you.
I've got a question.
Yes.
So, would it be accurate to, I guess, describe the Golden Buddha as like, I don't know, the energy found within feeling and experience?
The energy found within.
Feeling and experience.
Can you say a little bit? Yeah.
Yeah, because I'm still trying to get my head around it in a way that clicks with me. I guess like when you're going through something, when there's something that upsets you or brings you joy or makes you sad or whatever your current like emotional interaction with the world is. The energy that comes up from that experience, whether it's wanting to run towards it and be totally immersed in it or recoil from it and get away from it. If I'm understanding correctly, like that all of that is the crack. And so from that, the experience itself is bringing about this energy. And that energy is expressing itself in a certain way. And the way that energy expresses itself, whether it's to run towards it, get away from it, however, that is the Golden Buddha. Is that closer?
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful way to work with these themes. Ultimately, this is the wholeness and integrity of life flowing through us. Life with a capital L, not just organic, not just the stuff we understand as organic life. But this is the universe flowing through us in all its wholeness. And sometimes we feel like we can kind of grab part of that and like monetize it or turn it into something. This goes to Koshin talking about gaining mind, and that energy is, if we want to call it energy, it's wiser and older and bigger and more mysterious than anything that could be held. It's ultimately prajna, it's ultimately wisdom. So, yeah, keep exploring.
Thank you.